I work in a field called quantum computing. Just in a few sentences, what is quantum computing? I would say I'm no longer as driven by this idea to change the world. It took a long time for me to realize, but was a little bit ego-driven.
But Krishanu, we need people like you to be ego-driven because that's how we can push society forward.
My doubts in my current job have been there since I started applying because I thought, why the heck is Amazon wanting to build a quantum computer? We're always told, find your passion. You want to get to some endpoint. When in actuality, sometimes a job or a move or an action can be the right choice right now to teach you things. In our 30s, we do a lot more adulting in our mind, where we're thinking, is this something I can justify spending time on? I want to go do something which I enjoy, but then I ask myself, can I justify this?
Welcome back to That 30 Show. I am flying solo today. G was supposed to be here, but just this morning, it sounded like she just woke up with the worst sore throat. But I am still so excited for you all to tune in to this week's episode because I had an amazing interview and conversation with my friend Krishanu. Krishanu is probably the smartest guy I've ever met. This is a really great sequel to our career episode a few weeks ago, which surprisingly has gone, at least relative to our normal numbers, fairly viral because it's about 3 times the amount of plays that we usually get. So I don't know what's going on or what's in the water out there, but either all my colleagues listen to it or everyone wants to quit their job too. So, I mean, Krishanu is coming to us as someone who worked his whole life to be in the field of mathematics. It's something that he's really passionate about. And currently he works in quantum computing, which is, as a nerd, just the coolest thing ever. But as life moves on and evolves and he changes as a person, he's starting to question what he wants to do in the next few decades. You know, is this a field he wants to stay in for the rest of his life? Very interesting because I don't think it's often that I get a chance to connect with someone who's working literally at the cutting edge of a technology. Like his job is to develop technology, quantum computers that don't currently exist, and sort of the moral, personal, ethical implications that sort of come with that. Just an overwhelmingly interesting and awesome person, if I may say so. And I hope you all enjoy the conversation as well. All right. Well, welcome so much, Krishanu, to That 30 Show. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, G is not feeling well today, so I will represent her and ask the more chill questions if I can, along with some of my more deeper questions that I like. But yeah, so glad to have you on the show. How are you doing this morning?
Great. I'm a huge fan of the show and what you both are doing. I listen to it on my runs, and it's amazing to get all the different perspectives on all the ways that people can live in their 30s. And yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of honored to be here and to be able to just share a little bit. And mostly this is just a conversation between us because we haven't caught up in a while now.
Yeah. Last time I saw you, we went on a hike with our partners, maybe like half a year or almost a year ago now.
It was last summer, I think. Yeah, July.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a bit about sort of what you do and in any facet you want. But I just want to say, like, personally, Krishanu is, I don't want to make you feel awkward or anything, but like, there's a few people that I've met in my life that I really, really look up to and admire. And like, I instantly felt a deep level of admiration and respect when I first met you for many different reasons. You're a super thoughtful guy. Clearly very, very intelligent, but also just really humble, down to earth. And you push yourself in so many different ways. And you've accomplished so many interesting things. So I am personally so excited to get you on the pod, get your thoughts. I'm sure we could talk for hours, but yeah, I know we don't want to define ourselves by our job, but that is sort of maybe a theme that we want to unpack today in terms of where you feel your life journey, your career journey is heading. But tell us a bit more about Krishanu and what's what you're about.
Yeah, there's so many, I guess there's so many dimensions to us, but maybe career is for much of my life, I'd say that's what defined my identity. So that's a good place to start. I thought about this a bit that in some ways the what I think of as my job or my career isn't fully captured by my literal place of employment or job that I do right now. So this kind of exists in four layers, and at the deepest layer, the sort of like the all-encompassing one, since I was a little kid, I've thought of myself as a math nerd, or maybe eventually later mathematician, where I seek patterns. I always was, as a kid, building things and playing around with numbers and solving puzzles. I sort of developed this vision as a young kid that I want to share that joy. To me, it's just like unbridled joy. Uh, and I want to share that joy with people, and I want to use that to make the world a better place. I guess that's like, the 10-year-old's like dream, not really knowing what better place means. And it just so happens that things like physics and computers and technology conform well to the structure of math, but there are lots of other places in the world which are not as quote unquote valued, but which do conform, like rock climbing or fixing bicycles or farming, all sorts of places. These patterns appear. So yeah, at the deepest level, that I'd say that's what defines me. And then one layer lower, right now I'm in a phase where I'm in industry focused on building new technology. And this is a place where things have changed in the last 5 years, because previously, until I was 28, I was pursuing the path of trying to be an academic mathematician. I wanted to learn new math, do research to push the boundaries, add to the knowledge that people have, and then I wanted to teach, to share that knowledge and those skills with people, with students. And I decided to leave that institutional form of doing mathematics for a couple of reasons, which we can dive into.
Just out of curiosity for the audience, how sort of far did you get on that journey in terms of the academic part?
Far in terms of the linear track that the institution set. I did a PhD, and then I did a 2-year postdoc at University of British Columbia, which is how I developed connections with Vancouver.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were pretty far along that, because you say it very nonchalantly because you're a humble guy, but to get a PhD, to have that sort of opportunity, usually that's quite already a significant investment of time, energy, and ability towards a direction, and to even decide or feel that that's you want to pivot from away from that. Did that come easily to that realization or that decision?
I mean, a PhD in math, I think in the world that we live in, it maybe unfairly so acts as a very strong stamp that allows you to transition into other jobs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So for example, it wasn't so difficult to find places I could use those skills in industry.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, it was a far way along the path. And I wouldn't have gone that far if I were not, in some sense, a true believer from an early stage, where it's like I want to do undergrad, and during undergrad I just studied lots of math. And then I was like, I want to do a 5-year PhD, and
Mm-hmm.
doing that 5-year PhD involved a lot of just sitting in a room thinking about math alone.
So, in the industry experiences that you've had of late, are you utilizing I mean, obvious, I would assume you are, but to what extent are you utilizing the mathematic background and training you have? And does it satisfy your love of working with math in terms of what you do now?
Yes and no. So yeah, here's probably a place where it's worth going to the third layer down, which is I work in a field called quantum computing.
Okay.
And just in a few sentences, uh, what is quantum computing? It's kind of the brainchild of physicists in the 70s and 80s realized that some of the computations they had to do for their simulations that they were doing in theoretical physics would become unscalable on ordinary computers, and they needed a new model of computing which essentially to build such a thing involves developing new physics and new technology. And it's been a multi-decades project to try to build that. And, as they try to build the technology, they discover new physical challenges and they have to develop new theory, and then it keeps going. And the field is at a current point where there is actually a use for mathematics, and it's not like I'm literally taking the research I was doing as a mathematician and applying
Sure.
it, but a lot of the way of thinking, the ability to draw connections between different areas, the ability to read a lot of papers and see the abstract patterns and put them into practice. And then as well, just I've picked up software, I would say, relatively quickly as a result of my mathematical background. So like I write a lot of code to do simulations. And
I don't know if this is an ignorant question, but I'll ask it because of my technical curiosity. You mentioned the word patterns a lot. So the recent improvements in what we generally call AI now, and even before that, the idea of big data and stuff. From a layperson, my understanding is that computers, AI, big data is able to mass analyze patterns in a way that the human mind cannot. How does that complement or influence your industry or your job in any way?
yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know if you've heard of GitHub Copilot. It's crazy. You can literally you can install this into your code editor, and you can type out a one sentence description of what is the function you want to implement,
Right.
and then it'll just generate a bunch of code.
So you do use these AI tools in your job?
I don't, because I find that generally the actual writing of the code is not so complicated. It's more trying to figure out we're writing code to simulate some type of physics, but for sure there are ways to use these tools to figure out what code to write or figure out what to investigate. At the heart of it, AI is just really, really advanced statistical models and statistical regression, which have been used throughout these fields for, as long as computers have been around.
The G side of my brain is like, okay, David, pull it back. Let's get away from the nerdy technical stuff. You said so that was the third layer, right?
Yeah, there was one other thing in your question I didn't address, which was, does my job satisfy that mathematical side? And I would say there's a big
Yes.
side it doesn't, which is it feels like a lot of the joy of understanding the deep ideas is gone in a way, which when I was in my 20s and in my teens and just learning math with other people, and we're like, oh, this is so cool, like this is such a beautiful idea. Now it's like it's just to be able to build something to accomplish something.
Well, is it because you've reached a level of mathematics where you're not really understanding like you've understood everything? Like there's no new formula or ideas or something that you need to understand. You've learned it all, and now you're just applying it in an almost engineering way to develop new technology. So is there an area of mathematics left for you to discover?
Lots.
Oh,
I
yeah?
think that as I both as I went through grad school, I realized at some point I can't learn everything. There's so much math. For example, as I got towards the end of grad school, I felt there was a lot of probability theory, which I find really alluring. And I felt like I never understood this well. And I thought I'd love to just pick up a couple books and really understand this well, but I just don't have the time to do it, because if I do that, I won't be able to compete in theorem proving, so then I won't get a job. And that always to me felt like, okay, having a job in math means that I just won't be able to enjoy math as much, which is a shame. And the joy of teaching and connecting with students, I sorely miss. That's the biggest thing, which I feel is not present.
So I think the takeaway and how I might draw relevance to a wider audience here is this idea of you used to partake in this passion and activity in a way that brought you quite a lot of joy, the teaching side, probability theory and all that. And then now you're sort of quote unquote advanced to a point where you are you're like promoted, right? Kind of like
Yeah.
to do this even quote unquote better and more amazing thing where you're now pushing the boundaries of what existing technology looks like in quantum computing. But by doing so, you're more removed from the the thing that got you there in the first place, which is what you
Yes.
actually want to do. We talked about that a little bit in our career episode in a very, very, it is imperfect analogy to you, which is when you get promoted to like a manager position, you're often more removed from the work that got you there and you're just managing people's problems. And you're like, wait, I actually want to, like a teacher, right? Like principal versus teacher. When you're a principal, you're not with the kids anymore. You're just managing problems with the parents and stuff. And you might tell yourself, oh, I really miss just being with the kids. And maybe that's kind of what you're feeling.
Yeah, I think as well, sometimes you don't know what it was about the activity that you really loved until later you realize, oh, I thought this is what I loved, but actually it was this other thing. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me, for example, even when I was an academic mathematician, I found it very lonely. And to some people, thinking about things alone is fine, but to me, being in community is very important. And I noticed when I was working with one collaborator, every time he told me, if you could just figure out this one question for me, that would help me so much. Instantly, I noticed I'm 10 times more motivated to answer that
Hmm.
question. Some people don't feel that way, but it told me that, okay, I'm a person who draws a lot of energy off of the needs of others and
Mm.
being in community with others.
Mm.
And that's something to keep in mind when I decide, you know, how I channel my energy later.
Right, right. I want to touch upon the childhood aspect that you mentioned, but was there like a fourth layer that you wanted to mention as well in terms of like who Krishanu is and what your
Absolutely. And I'm worried if I mention the fourth layer, it could crack open the big like political stuff. But
okay. You can tease it or I don't know.
yeah, I'll mention the fourth layer and then we'll dive into it later. So the fourth
Okay.
layer, I mentioned quantum computing. The fourth layer is my literal employer and job title, which is the Amazon Center for Quantum Computing, which is in Pasadena, California. Quantum computing lab, mostly physicists, but all sorts of engineers. I sort of identify as a mathematician, but I guess right now I'm doing mix of software engineering and thinking about physics. And day to day, I read papers, I write simulations. The study of physics itself has been financially intensifying over the decades. So as a result, in order to do and make any progress in the field, you have to be at a place that has a ton of money. So that means either a government lab or a tech company.
So when you talk about your childhood and you played around with numbers and you had this fascination, wonder, you want to spread the love, kind of like spread the joy of playing with numbers and understanding mathematical concepts. So it sounds like you were blessed with a understanding or a knowledge of what your passion is from a very young age, compared to someone like me, where to this day I'm still trying to figure out what my life passion is. Like some people grow up being like, oh, I want to be an airplane pilot. I never had that, but it sounds like you did have that, which is both a pro and a con because now it sounds like you've suddenly come to a point where you are having to redefine the identity that you spent so many years building up. How was that sort of psychologically, emotionally to come to a point where you might start doubting whether this is your life path?
You hit the nail on the head. Very like earth shaking for me. I would say when I first started having doubts about whether I wanted to be an academic mathematician, I'd say in undergrad. I remember being on the flight to some summer math research program and being like, dang, I should have been a mechanical engineer. Then I could actually build things people would use. I'm
Okay.
just going to do something useless. And I would say over the years, like I've constantly had doubt. In 2019, when I left academic math, I tried to release my identity as being a mathematician. And I realized later, oh, I'm stuck with this. Like this, this is like part of who I am. But I would say that the thing I'm still trying to disentangle is it's very different to do something in an institutional setting versus just to do it in the sense that I can think that like being a practitioner and lover of math does not have to mean that that is what my paid employment is. I maybe only connected her recently, but one of my close friends who also was a mathematician, he always found it really frustrating that he wants to learn all these different areas of math, which he finds beautiful, but if he does that, he can't compete in the job market.
It's such an interesting sort of concept where you can love something and be able to be paid to do that something, but at the same time, you also don't have to. You don't have to make it your job. Let's say I like teaching, right? I like working with kids. Well, I can volunteer
Yeah.
and help kids that way. I don't have to make it my job. And when I do make it my job, it comes with its own baggage. When it becomes an institutionalized, paid sort of like, well, who's the company? Who, as I think what you've told me in the past, like sort of, well, who's benefiting from this?
Yeah. I actually see this in the world of professional sports. I
Okay.
mean, the one of the key examples of something which I was really, really into, frankly, was not very talented at, and didn't get paid to do it, but still spent a lot of time on it, is running, which is in grad school. I got really into distance running. And initially, honestly, part of the reason I got into it is I was really angsty about my research and about exactly this sort of doubt. And I found that going running just helped a lot with processing the thoughts. And I
Mm-hmm.
got really into competitive distance running, and running 5Ks and 10Ks and track races, and trying to make my times faster. And I wasn't particularly fast by any objective standards, but
Mm-hmm.
that didn't have to mean I valued it any less. It was just sort of a pursuit of joy. And then similarly, I do see, in the various sports I followed, there are ex-professional athletes who will say, oh, when I was pursuing it as a professional, I felt that I had to be so stressed about my weight and what I ate, and like resting at the right times. I couldn't really just have fun with doing the activity. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about certain rock climbers I know, or cyclists who are like, they still do it just as much or nearly as much as they used to, but they don't perform at like, they perform at 97% of their previous level, but they just get a lot more joy from it. And they decide that if they can make money, they can still find ways to make money to
Mm-hmm.
support themselves, but they can just do it with much more joy. And that feels like a good trade off.
So I don't want to put you on the spot in any sort of compromising way, obviously. So I don't know what you can talk about in terms of your reflections on the next 5 years of your career, what that might look like. But I think it would be interesting if you're able to share any thoughts on where you think the next 5 years of your professional career will go. Is it going to be the same? Do you think or aspire to something different? And if so, why?
So I mentioned three layers, and I was thinking my intentions are to deconstruct the bottom three layers. Sort of rewind all the way back to the point where I'm not even thinking of myself as a professional mathematician. I mean, if we even think, what does the word professional mean? It sort of belies the system of certification and the system of, the institute. You go through a system of professional training, which both gives you certain skills to navigate that career, but
Mm-hmm.
also puts a stamp on you, which tells institutions and tells employers, okay, this person is bought in and it will follow
Mm.
the rules. And I guess I'm starting to feel like I don't really like that system very much, and I want to take mathematics a bit. If whatever I do with mathematics, I want to take outside of that system, but more broadly, I just want to exist outside of that system and do something different. I honestly don't I don't have a very clear plan for what's going to
Mm.
come next. I do want to go back to India for a while. When I last came to visit Vancouver, there was one period of time where Todd, my partner, and I were sailing on a boat, and I was observing like all the places we could go with this boat, and the sailors who were like showed us a bit how to tie knots and put up sails. And I was thinking like there's a whole world of things one can do which I don't know how to do, which I would love to learn how to do, and which I feel being very focused in this professional world, like I don't know. I've just kind of existed in a bubble, which I want
Mm.
to move out of.
What that sort of makes me think about is a much bigger picture concept, which is purpose, essentially.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Earlier, you said that you wanted to, you mentioned at one point, I think, oh, this is how I'm going to help the world or humanity is by teaching other people math, because math is inherently useful or good. So
yeah.
there was this driving there, that was some sort of driving motivating factor for what you wanted to do with your life, what was your purpose. And certainly there's many different ways to do it, and it sounds like, hey, you're thinking, is there a way to do it outside of this institutionalized system? But can we clarify, does the goal remain the same and you're just trying to find another way to do it? So what are you driven by? Are you still driven by this desire to change the world, or what, or can you be more specific than that?
Yeah, I would say I'm no longer as driven by this idea to change the world.
But you were before?
I was, yeah, like
Okay.
and this is actually something which it took a long time for me to realize, but was a little bit ego driven in the sense that I always had this feeling that my parents gave a lot to get me the education that I got, to give me the opportunities and the choice that I had. And with that, I carried this idea in my mind of like, don't screw it up, like, make the most of this. I've been given the privilege to learn this thing to such a deep level and to be able to learn it without distractions. So I
Mm-hmm.
better make the most of it, and I better do something important. But that also kind of carries under it this idea that, oh, I'm important and I can do something great, and so I should do something great. And I think now I holding on to that can be very, I mean, not only is it a little bit arrogant, but it's also just damaging to my own happiness to try to hold on to the idea that I want to change the world rather than to just exist in the world. I'm starting to change my mind that the way you change the world is not just in these big, grand, sweeping, change the theory, the underlying theory of math or physics or something, but also just helping people in small ways around you, being aware of inequalities in your community. And that's sort of a learning process for me. But
I'm sure there's a lot that we can unpack in terms of the idea of how do we define a force of for good in the world? What does that look like? I'm tempted to give you examples of in terms of like technology people, right? Like if we think of tech titans who have advanced, yeah, like, and then you'll probably push back like, what do you mean by advanced? Is actually
right, right,
like,
right,
the
right,
Steve
yeah,
Jobs, the Elon Musks of the world. But a part of me is hearing that, and I'm like, but Krishanu, we need people of your ability and talent to be a force for good in the world, lift people out of poverty, or I don't know what it is that you can do with what you with, like, for example, when we went to the moon, it developed a lot of technologies that helped. But then again, I'm sure you'll be like, okay, well, how did it help? So
right, right, yeah,
like
yeah. No, it's a good
we
question. It's hard.
we need people like you to be ego driven in a way, because that's how we can push society forward. But then I don't know if you want to unpack that, because I know what you might think about that. Maybe the audience doesn't. So why can't you be a force for good, like to push society forward?
This could be a good place to say a little bit about how my thinking on quantum computing has changed over
Okay,
the last year and a
sure.
half from being at Amazon, and not specifically from being at Amazon, but
Just the
just
field.
from yeah, yeah, just from observing and thinking, um, which is that so my doubts in my current job, I mean, have been there since I started applying because I thought, why the heck is Amazon wanting to build a quantum computer? Like, doesn't make any sense to me. I changed my mind when I realized, as I said before, you have to be at a company or a entity, a government entity with a lot of money to do any field work in the field, and I wanted to keep working in the field.
Mhm.
Um, but the question I started thinking is, okay, so I think of building a quantum computer as this grand challenge, this thing which will add new knowledge to humanity.
Mhm.
Who is it actually going to serve? Like, who will be benefited by building a quantum computer? Well, I mentioned it was the brainchild of these physicists in the 70s and 80s. So okay, it's going to probably benefit physicists in their role doing physics research. They'll be able to do computations more easily, develop theory more easily.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, but it's benefiting the field of physics. Who wants that physics done? And then it's the funding bodies who fund it. And then I asked, okay, where does funding for physics come from? If you trace it, it's mostly coming from military branches of the government. And there's you can compare this with the history of the semiconductor and computer industry. There's a book called Chip
Mm.
War by Chris Miller, which is really good on this, where it's like the first applications tend to be military or space, which is kind of
Mm-hmm.
connected to geopolitics, US and
Mm.
Soviet competing
Mm-hmm.
with each other. And then eventually, once it gets cheap enough, it'll spill over into consumer markets. But even then, it's questionable, like in what ways is it benefiting versus hurting people? It's really a mixed bag.
Mm.
Okay, so the question of does technology make the world better or worse? It really depends on the technology. Maybe one axis along which to think about it is does it concentrate power or does it distribute power? And AI is a really good example to think of here, where over time, the AI that's being used is more and more impossible to use unless you're a really, really big player. And I see that kind of trend happening. There are so many directions to have smart people. I don't even know. Smart is such a broad term. Like so many directions to develop things, and some can be good, some can be bad. It all depends on your perspective. But the idea of linear progress, it's a lot more complex than that. And I always thought that if adding knowledge is always good, but the reality is if I'm a person in a village and I open up a physics paper and it says if you fabricate so and so Josephson junction at so and so nanometers on like something arsenide like chip at 4 degrees Kelvin, like that knowledge doesn't. I can't act on that knowledge. That knowledge means nothing to me. Like you can only act on that knowledge if you have $1 million. So
Yes.
who actually has the knowledge? Like the knowledge is so tied up in the technology, right? For me, I do have this belief that math that can be very simply explained, like not with jargon, but just like very simply explained, feels like a pure and true form of knowledge which anybody can access. There are such forms of knowledge, but ones which are fundamentally tied to technology feel less that way to me.
You're giving me really strong Oppenheimer vibes right now.
Yes, yes,
Do you know what I
very
mean?
much.
It's
Yeah,
basically it, right? It's like we are scientists and we are developing and discovering new science and new technologies, but it's just so often, and I think the atomic bomb is probably the most fitting example for any conversation about this. Is like ultimately, but I think that's I don't know if irony is the right word, but that is often the case, which is that war is one of, if not the biggest drivers of technological advancement in human history, right? And you don't even have to think about microchips or whatever. It's like, going from bows and arrows to gunpowder, that's technological advancement. What is that for? It's for war. Anyway, I don't have a point. I don't have a question there. I was just, it's, yeah, like I think
yeah, yeah.
it's interesting for someone in your shoes and with the opportunities that you have, you are faced with the same dilemmas that I think we saw in the movie Oppenheimer, right? In terms of the doubts that maybe uh, the scientists working on that project had.
I also recognize within myself, I'm sort of conditioned as a straight A student in the sense that I like pleasing the superiors. I like solving, if somebody comes up and gives me an interesting puzzle to solve, the question of whether it's for good or evil sometimes gets ignored due to the fact that it's just a really fun challenge. And it's like, dang, I just want to work this out and I want to come up with a really good straight A solution that
Yeah.
will get me an A on the test and feel satisfied about it. And then only later am I like, oh God, did I just build an atomic bomb? I mean, I
Yeah.
personally am never facing that scale of issue because I'm not that.
Well, I don't know when they talk about AI and I mean quantum computing, I'm sure can propel AI to a whole new level, right? Anyways, we're getting to science fiction a bit more.
Yeah.
I want to ask sort of a broader question reflecting on everything sort of you said. So it definitely sounds like you've had a lot of reflections, revelations, new ways of thinking, lessons learned, basically a normal human life. You're in your early mid 30s, I think, and so that's all fine and good. I wonder if you have a child, or if you were to talk to a younger Krishanu, right? Let's say early 20s Krishanu, or if your child is graduating from university, based on the lessons that you've learned, the revelations that you've had, would you want to do anything differently? Would there be advice you want to give your younger self, or is it just very much a matter of, well, life has to be lived. You have to learn the lessons the hard way. I wouldn't change anything about the process.
What you just said, life has to be lived. You have to learn things the hard way. I think that's one of the things I would emphasize is that we're always told find your passion.
Yeah.
We sort of envision you want to get to some end point with no clear timeline of when that endpoint exists, and also the idea that that passion or that purpose is a fixed thing, which from time n onwards it will continue to be true. When in actuality, sometimes a job or a move or an action can be the right choice right now to teach you things. Like I remember early last year, I caught up with a mentor of mine who used to be an experimental physicist, and now he works in industry. And I was telling him about all these doubts I was having and all this frustration, these things I was realizing. And he said, Krishanu, this is wonderful. Like, I'm so glad you're doing this job because you're seeing things and you're learning things, and it's painful, but like this is like you have to go through this to actually gain the understanding. Sometimes you have to do something that isn't right in order to figure out what is right. And there are many things that aren't right, which will teach you more about yourself. And so I think not having so much focus on where you want, like, the abstract future, but the only reality that exists is right now. So just focusing on what you're doing right now and sort of learning from that and experiencing that to the fullest. The other piece of advice I would give is like not being afraid to jump. At some point, you'll be able to tell, oh, I'm continuing to do this because I'm fearful, rather than I'm continuing to do this because I'm expanding and learning from it. And when it starts to become I'm staying here because I'm fearful and of the unknown, then it's hard. It's really hard, but being able to identify that and make a move.
I think one of the ways that we can have those hard life lessons and learn more about what is right, as you said, or what is more suitable, appropriate direction that we want to take. A lot of these revelations and learnings comes from interesting life experiences that we put ourselves through, whether it's a job that challenges us, whether it's a hike that we never think we can do, but we've accomplished it, and it gives us a new sense of what we are capable of. I know that you recently had a fairly long trip back home to India. So I want to talk about that. But I also need a washroom break. We'll come back and unpack your India trip and sort of what you took away from that experience. So you recently went to India for a couple months, was it? So how long was the trip?
Yeah, I left mid-February, came back mid-April, so 2 months.
Okay, so that's a long time to take a break from your work, from your life. Why did you go on this trip?
Yeah, so a monologue a little bit here. This actually starts in 2014. Even more background. Both my parents are from India. They're from two different parts of India. My mom is from Bengal, which is in the east. My dad is from Tamil Nadu, which is in the south. But they both emigrated to North America, first Canada and then the US. And I was born and raised here. I've lived here my whole life. And although I've gone back to India periodically as a kid, I've never had a strong connection to the place. We always spoke English growing up. I never really learned either language very well. And so I'm through and through American, you could say, with some little bits of Indian influence. And every time I went back to India growing up, I felt the cultural it's so culturally different, and it's so different in everyday life. You could say it's less convenient, things don't run on time, it's a little bit dirtier, it's a little bit hotter. The ways people interact is much more communal, which can be tough to adjust to. And so as a kid, I felt like I never really was very open to being Indian. But 10 years ago, which was pretty much the last time I went to India, actually, we went to Manik Bajar, which is the name of the village that my mother's father is from. And it's in Bengal, and it's a rice farming village, and nobody speaks English there. And I remember going there just having this strong feeling of wanting to reconnect to those roots and being really sad that I couldn't speak the language. And, everybody accepted me in like they all knew who I was. They knew everybody in the family. They instantly accepted me in and included me. And I felt like, okay, something about this place I want to connect to more. I want to get to know the stories of everybody in my family. And now I would say understanding where I came from helps me understand the kind of conditioning and the set of values that I was raised with. Why my parents valued math and science growing up, and why they brought me here instead of raising me there. And so that was 2014. And after that, I thought, okay, I'm going to start studying Bangla, which is the language there. And I'm going to learn enough that I can go back and I can spend more time in the village. But I was in the last year of my PhD, and eventually just got more focused on the professional world and my career and, life here. And so this trip here is actually, I kind of had a flip in my head about a year and a half ago, where I suddenly realized, as I was getting very jaded about professional world here, like what's important in life. Like this whole fantasy of I'm going to discover timeless knowledge that will add to humanity could just be an illusion. But for sure, understanding my roots and I've always loved travel and understanding different cultures. And I thought this is deeply important. So I'm gonna go back. And so this 2 month trip I did, sorry, I monologued a little bit there. That this 2 month trip is actually just a prelude to a longer trip I'm going to do. And I went because my mom, usually she goes around this time of year, and I said, "Hey, I'd like to go for a bit. Can I go with you?" And she's like, "Yeah, absolutely. We can reconnect to a lot of the old family, travel around, we can go to the village, we can go to these different places." And so that was the motivation for doing this trip. And to me, it was important enough that I told my employer, "Hey, I'm going. You can fire me or let me go." And they're like, "Oh yeah, it's totally fine. You can go." Uh,
We're
yeah.
not going to fire quantum computing scientist extraordinaire Krishanu. Where we're going to find someone like you?
Oh,
Um,
they've got a whole
they got
assembly
plenty.
line. Yeah, yeah. It'd be fine.
So, what were your takeaways from these 2 months, and maybe more specifically, anything that relates to our conversation so far?
I mean, one definite takeaway is I was very nervous beforehand about, I haven't planned out exactly what I'm going to do on this trip. And it's kind of similar to a couple of years ago when I did the bike trip from Vancouver to San Francisco. And I thought, oh, I'm not prepared. I don't know exactly what's going to come. And then as soon as I started biking, I realized I can just figure it out as I go and it'll be fine. So I feel a lot more confidence about doing my longer trip next time. But there were some very definite takeaways I brought back. So firstly, understanding the language more deeply helps me understand a lot of the ways that I talk with family and talk with my mom makes more sense. So for example, um, in Bengali, there is a word to say thank you, but it's very formal and it's very rarely used. And what I noticed in my interactions with people there, especially with family, but more generally, is people just much more readily notice when you need help and take care of you and do things. And there's no thank you expected. So there's much more of this sort of communal social fabric where people are looking out for each other, which as soon as I came back to the US, it felt like very cold and sterile and isolated, which sometimes it can be frustrating because they're always in your face. Like every 3 minutes, my aunt is asking me how I'm doing, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also very warm. Um, So that's one of the big takeaways. There are several more, but
Being in that very different culture, did it make you more motivated to eventually change your present life path? Did it make you even more confident that there's another way that you want to try and live life at some point in the future?
yes, yeah. I think a lot of my fear when I started to feel like this work being a scientist is fun, like I solve puzzles, but it's not fulfilling. It was very scary because I didn't know any other way to like if I quit and just were unemployed, I wouldn't know how to fill my time. I wouldn't know how to form a community. I feel much more like there is something there after coming back from India.
Do you have any idea what that vaguely looks like?
I do think that the way of interact for sure something I want to do is go back and spend more time in India, understanding my family, traveling around, understanding the culture. So that's definitely there. Otherwise, I think just the mode of interacting with people around me and the I mentioned like noticing more when people need things and taking care and having more of this constant reciprocity and not worrying about. Here's another difference. I feel like people don't really get offended as much in India, at least in Bengal where I was. Like people just say what they think and just a lot of this pretense, which often in my daily life in the West, I'm wondering, oh, I want to ask this person if they want to hang out. Oh, but are we close enough? Oh, but like, is it weird if I ask this person this? Is asking too much? What's the level of obligation? It's like, no, I just don't think about that as much anymore. And it's very freeing. And I feel like that will make it easier to just build community and build relationships with people. This question of what is science being and technology being used for, an event which shifted my thinking on this quite a bit was October 7th last year.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know if this is a topic it's okay for me to get into here.
You can talk about anything you want.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that basically seeing everything the US government and the US military has done in that time has made me deeply cynical about the US government. There are strong pushes for divestment from in universities from the military, which I think is really good. And I've been trying to, just in whatever way I can be present or support, sort of be there. But I think that these sort of political battles are, to me, a way to have impact. And some of the fields of like physics and building technology feel fundamentally tied to military, which
Yeah.
might just be inevitable. But
Mm-hmm.
I do think that this is a way I would be interested in spending time and energy is like political pushes and political efforts.
So I think it's these recent events have made you even more wary of any possibility that your life contribution is benefiting military purposes.
Yeah, state or military. And I know it's complicated, but in this case, it feels like in this specific case of what's happening, it feels to me like, okay, what the US is doing is very
Mm.
bad. Yeah,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
yeah.
There's a couple of things I wanted to get to though, which is I don't have a lot of people in my life. I'm not in the circles that you are in. I think that are as I would say conventionally, as you said, smart. What does that mean, right? But like in the conventional sense, as smart, as sort of accomplished, or have the potential to move the needle
Hmm.
as you. And you also mentioned offhand, right? You took a bike trip from Vancouver to San Francisco.
Right, right.
You used to competitively do distance running and stuff. So you push yourself in many different physical, intellectual ways, and you're very successful in doing a lot of these things. Where does this ability and competence and quote unquote success? I think you're successful. I just put quotes because everyone defines success differently.
Yeah,
But where
yeah,
does
yeah.
it come from? Talent, upbringing, hard work.
Yeah.
Why are you so awesome?
I think we're all I think everybody is awesome if you ask them the right questions. So thank you for asking good questions. uh, I'm going to spin it in a way which sounds bad, which is something I had growing up was blind belief. By that, I mean, for, part of what allowed me to excel as much as I did in math was having a space created where I could blindly believe that it was a good thing and that it was okay to just focus on this and not worry about any of the realities of the world. And sometimes
Okay.
that cocoon is what's necessary for you to be able to focus single-mindedly on something for long enough to develop some ability so that when you go out and then you see, oh, the world is a lot more complex than I thought, you do have this skill to fall back on. And I think that my parents both did that while also not being the stereotypical, the stereotypical Asian parent is like, you have to be a doctor, you have to do this, you have to do that. And I think my parents have really emphasized choice. For example, when I talk to my mom about these existential struggles with being a scientist, she says, it sounds like you're seeking something spiritual. And like, I don't want to downplay that side as well that my parents gave me, but I do think growing up, it was like a lot of blind belief helped. And it's the same reason I think that it's a lot easier to learn subjects while you're in school in your 20s than it is in your 30s. It's not that you're less smart, your brain's less capable. It's just that your brain isn't pulled in all these different directions. You can kind of just assume that getting the grade is all that's important.
I think the key point there for me is the word focus. I know you use the word blind belief, and that's interesting psychologically as well. But focus, it sounds like, is what allowed you to make the strides that you did. Maybe back then you weren't also running marathons. You weren't also taking care of chores at home. You had one job, and it was math. And when you do that for over a long period of time, that's how you can see significant progress. And I like that you mentioned in your 30s it's a lot harder, right? Because you have the quote unquote adulting that you have to do. You have life, maybe you have kids.
In your 30s, you have to do a lot more adulting, and that's, chores and relationship and all.
Yeah.
I do think we also do a lot more in our 30s. We do a lot more adulting in our mind where we're thinking, is this something I can justify spending time on? Or at least during some periods of time, I do, where it's like, I want to go do something which I enjoy, but then I ask myself, can I justify this? And the time spent trying to think about, can I justify this? Sometimes it's better spent just doing the thing.
Tell me a bit about your physical and exercise. I just think that's an interesting part about you. I want to put it on air. What are some of the more things that you've done that you're proud of, that you've enjoyed? Marathons, hikes.
I will mention that I think my approach to physical sports as a significant portion of my life started in 2013 or so in grad school when I started getting into running. It has shifted over the years in the sense that when I started, it was like I was very clear that I want to run a mile in under 5 minutes. I want to be able to run 5 miles in under 30 minutes. It was entirely defined by these clear time goals, and I was extremely regimented about the way I approached it. Like, I'm going to study what the professionals do, and I'm going to read lots of books and like be very, 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 very rigid. In some ways, I regret that because I didn't appreciate the more adventurous side of these physical sports, which I got into more in Vancouver when I realized all this fitness I've built up from doing running for all these years enables me to go experience these beautiful places, like go outdoors and explore in the mountains. And it would be a real shame if I didn't take advantage of that. And slowly over time, my physical pursuits have shifted to be less about the time goals and more about being able to go to really incredible places and bring other people to incredible places and be fit enough that I'm not at my limit and I can help take them there. But then I also got into road cycling and I rode my bike around a lot of places there. One summer I did something called the Triple Crown, which is This is probably well suited to, I assume a lot of your listeners are in Vancouver, but it's
Yeah.
climbing cypress, grouse, and Seymour on a bike in one day, on a road bike,
Damn.
and eating a lot of food. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so that was a fun day. I like camping a lot. I've gotten more into it, and I loved the idea of biking a long distance over many days and camping out as I went. And probably the most accessible form of that is the along the Pacific coast. And there's a route that goes from Vancouver all the way down to Tijuana in Mexico. And I rode about half of it, or a little more than half of it, from Vancouver to San Francisco on a bike with my camping gear strapped on the back. Yeah, 25 days. That was great. That was a lot of fun.
Whenever I hear stories like this, I want to know like what drives people like you to do what you do with the physical feats, with the intellectual accomplishments. These are not easy things. And certainly, I don't think that I'm saying that everyone just does things that are easy, but certainly when things are hard, it requires quite a significant amount of motivation or purpose that makes you willing to suffer through it. Are you someone who just like the puzzles that you mentioned? You just like overcoming challenge for the sake of overcoming challenge? Is it driven by some other, you said ego earlier, maybe when you're younger there was maybe a bit of ego there. How do you decide what to do with the time that you have? Why do you go on a 25-day bike ride?
I think that I mean, the 25-day bike ride did seem like less of a, oh, I want to do this to prove. There was a little bit of like, I want to see it. I'm curious to see how this would be. But like, I hesitate to compare any of these things to true, or I definitely wouldn't compare any of these things to true hardship and true suffering. But it is kind of you could say it's an unnecessary challenge to put on myself. It's unnecessary difficulty
Yes.
to
Yes.
put in life. Something like a good example is when I started running and I wanted to run a mile in under 5 minutes, I was trying to prove something to myself where from a young age, I always thought of myself as an unfit person. And I thought, well, if I can change myself from being what I consider an unfit person into what I consider a pretty decent runner, that will prove to me that any other thing in life where I think I'm bad at this, I could change myself over time into somebody where I'm good at this and it's part of my identity. And it's funny because in the end, the thing I accomplished, which I'm happiest about, is not running a fast time in the mile. It's being able to just go out and run for an hour and enjoy it. And it's such a privilege and I feel really lucky to have that as a thing that for my mental health and for my well-being that I can do. And to think like this is a way I can change myself and to know for any future challenge that okay, I can look back at the past experience and say, oh, I changed myself in that way. Um, I overcame that thing, so I should be able to overcome this thing too. Is really helpful.
It's almost kind of like you're going from blind belief to belief because it's no longer blind. You have
Yeah,
evidence.
yeah, exactly. And it's not like it's anything special about me as a person. Any person can do it.
I think that's such a great sentiment that you shared there about how just seeing yourself accomplish something that you were previously bad at or that you didn't know how to do, and then you develop competence in it. It's just the most empowering feeling I think that we can have, and it makes life, I don't know, fulfilling. I think is maybe a word, but yeah. I mean, it's been so interesting to hear about your story. Is there anything that I'm sure there's many things, but was there something coming into today that you did want to bring up or share that I didn't get a chance to ask you yet?
It kind of came up in our conversation, but it is something I wanted to mention about. This is a little vulnerable to say, uh, but it's something I feel has changed about me in the last year or year and a half, or maybe 2 years, which is um, for the longest time, I felt like I was looking for what I'll put in quotes, intellectual community. When I applied to grad school, I wrote it on my application that, oh, I've been doing like done all this stuff in math and individual competitions, but to me, it's all about finding community with whom to talk about these things. And I think for the longest time, I thought of it as, oh, I can only really talk about these things with a small section of the population. Like most people don't care. Most people I won't really connect with very well. I'm kind of an outsider. Maybe
Right.
there's a little bit of ego, even of like, oh, most people are not good enough at math or something.
But that's
Um,
true, though. I don't think that's an ego thing.
oh, well, okay, maybe. I mean, I think most people who don't know that much math, it's not because they aren't smart enough or anything. It's just that it's not like who cares about math really. I think one of the ways I've really changed is every person has an interesting story and every person has, interesting insights and experiences. And nowadays I look at any person I talk to and I'm like, oh, that person is like so interesting. And I like, they know all these things that I don't know. And I'd like to get to know their story a bit better. I mean, when I look back on it, it's like, dang, the previous me was very, like, I don't know, arrogant or something, but it's also made the world far more interesting to not have that like hierarchy in my mind of
Hmm.
like my place is among the sort of more like, I don't know.
It's more exclusive, the thing
Yeah,
you can talk about.
yeah.
I can see that it opens up almost like the possibilities of what is worthwhile to do in terms of the connections you're making, the experiences you're putting yourself into. Before it was this fairly small circle of mathematicians and physicists. And then now, because you have interest in a lot more beyond that, then you're connecting with folks that who can't talk about math, but you're still finding value in their story, even though it has nothing to do with your lifelong passion of math.
Yeah. Well, that too, realizing that my lifelong passion of math, I could have been passionate about so many things. There's so many interesting things out there.
Right. I think maybe the takeaway that I have from your story, maybe not for me personally, but just to summarize, is like, let's not box ourselves in too rigidly into any one thing because it might really limit not ourselves necessarily in the like, it limits my life, not in the ego driven way, but it limits certainly your life, but then as a result it might limit your impact on others as well. There's many ways you
Yeah.
can impact others. Mathematician is one way, there's 1,000 other ways, and now it sounds like you are interested in the coming years or decades to make sure that your life impacts others in other ways as well.
Yeah. You put it really well. Yeah. Like it limits how you can interact with people and impact people.
Nice. Well, Krishanu, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
It's so interesting to talk to you every time, and I think it's a very humbling and vulnerable story that you shared because it's not easy. I think right to climb the mountain, to get to the top, if you will, and then to have the humility or the mindfulness to even consider if there are other mountains you should climb, because to climb those other mountains you have to start from the bottom again, and not many people will want to go from the top to the bottom.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage to do that.
I guess it's realizing that what's important isn't being at the top of, I don't need to be at the top of a mountain to see my own, and any of us have to be at the top of a mountain to see our own inherent worth.
Mm. Well, on that note, yeah, that's great. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, I appreciate your insights and being able to phrase things so eloquently.
uh, you're very welcome. Okay, well, until next time.
Yeah, take care.
All right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you did enjoy it, please let us know by giving us a rating on Spotify, dropping a review on Apple Podcasts, or basically just subscribing and following us on any podcast platform that you're using. If you have any feedback, questions, or if you think you have a story that you want to share, you definitely do. Let us know at that30showpod on Instagram, or you can email us at that30showpod@gmail.com. We would love to hear from more of our listeners, so do let us know what you think. You can also leave a quick comment on Spotify. There's a Q&A function there. With that, we'll be back with another episode. Sorry that this one was a little bit late coming out on the Monday. Life kind of gets in the way sometimes, but appreciate you all tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.